This conference will now be recorded.
All right. So welcome to our stakeholder workshop, June 8th of 2022. The purpose of this workshop is to begin discussing management action number 7, which is our initial surface recharge evaluation, specifically task 1, which is development of the evaluation criterion. All right, so this is a stakeholder workshop similar to the last two that we held. We're no longer operating under the advisory committee format. Anyone is welcome to ask any questions or provide any comments at any point in time during the dialogue. I'll pause at the end of each agenda item or even after specific slides and ask for your thoughts and comments. It's easier for me if you'll add your name into the chat using the chat bubble and go to and to let me know that you'd like to speak. But of course, anyone that wants to speak up verbally, that's just fine too. And then of course, as we do every time, any follow-up comments and questions can be sent to Stacy. Her email is here. She's the one that has distributed the agenda and the PowerPoint and good stuff, all that good stuff. So she should be easy to find in your email. And we will accept any sort of comments on the technical memorandum number 1 on the development of the evaluation criteria after this workshop, after we've had a chance to talk about it in today's workshop. If you have any comments that you'd like to send on to us, that would be really helpful for us to kind of be able to read through those thoughts afterwards as we're making any refinements to the criterion based on the conversations that we've had today. So here's our agenda. We've kind of done our welcome and introductions. I think I greeted all of you by name as you arrived. I want to just talk very, very briefly, a slide or two, about the scope of the initial surface water recharge evaluation. I think all of you had attended our November meeting where we presented on the scope that we were working on for this particular management action. So you should be familiar with that scope of work. We want to talk a little bit about potential recharge strategies, and in order to really develop the evaluation criteria, we have to have some kind of concept of what we mean by recharge strategies. And so these are very preliminary. We're going to have a whole nother task that talks about them, but we do want to kind of talk through the concepts that we've developed so far. We'll review the proposed evaluation criteria in detail. We'll go one by one through those. And then we'd like to do a values activity, which I'm really excited about, using a Menti tool. And so we'll do that. It'll take us to a kind of a separate website, and we'll do that. And then close up with public comment and next steps. So let's first start with the scope of the recharge strategy. So our scope ultimately is to produce a preliminary feasibility study to summarize surface water recharge opportunities in the San Pasqual Valley Basin. That's shown here, as you all know. The scope of that study includes a number of different tasks to get us to the materials that we need to develop that preliminary feasibility study. So we're starting today with task 1, and there will be a stakeholder workshop, as you know, associated with each of these tasks. So we start today with the evaluation criteria. We'll move into task 2, which are stream bed characteristics, and this is one of the tasks that was actually requested at our November workshop. We'll do a little bit of additional work on stream bed permeability characteristics, and Nate will actually speak to what our next steps are in terms of some of that field work in a little bit. Task 3 is to identify and quantify the water sources that would be available for recharge. Task 4 is to develop the potential recharge strategies. Like I said, we have some ideas of what those might look like, but we're really going to want to refine what types of, based on the identification of the sources and the quantity of water that we've identified as being available, we'll want to develop out those strategies a little bit, put some concept plans and concept drawings together, and those kinds of materials that will really support the feasibility analysis. We've got task 5, which are model simulations using our San Pasqual Valley GSP model that we developed as part of the GSP process. And then, of course, modeling the different scenarios that we identify. for recharge. And so that's the results piece of that task 5. And then finally, we'll use those outputs to evaluate benefits to groundwater dependent ecosystems. And that was also one of the primary comments that we received in our November workshop when we were scoping this whole effort, was to really kind of get a better handle on how changes in recharge and would have an effect on the groundwater dependent ecosystems in the valley. And all of that will be wrapped up into the feasibility study itself. So here is a schedule of the 24-month process that we've laid out for the surface water recharge evaluation. You can see here we kind of kicked off in about the March timeframe. We're now here in June. The green cells with the triangles are our stakeholder workshops. So we've got kind of the work on task 1 occurring in this first 5 months. We have just started to kick off our task 2 work here with some planning for the field work that we're going to be doing. We anticipate being able to present both task 2, the outcomes of that field work, and the water source analysis at our September workshop. And then we'll kind of move through each of these tasks as we move through the process and get to a preliminary feasibility study report toward the end of 2023. I did fudge that quarterly workshop time slot by about a month to make sure that we had enough time to do a proper public review process. We've got response to comments, and then getting those back out to stakeholders before we have a final plan developed. Are there any questions on the scope of the surface water recharge evaluation? Any comments? I don't see anything in our chat. Okay. So let's start with the potential recharge strategies. So in the development of our evaluation criteria, we had to kind of get a handle on what types of recharge strategies might we establish or develop in order to do this evaluation. What might those look like? And so in the scoping process, we identified 4 different types of strategy. They're kind of 4 different ways of doing recharge. Now there's a whole task that will be implemented, task 4, like I said, that will define what these strategies actually look like, and kind of using that water supply, the water availability analysis in task 3. But we had to have, we had to develop some kind of concept so that it would help support development of the evaluation criteria itself. If we're going to establish metrics to measure the success of the different recharge strategies, we had to have some concept of what those look like. So these are our preliminary thoughts. Nate's going to actually go through and kind of talk in a little bit more detail about what these might look like, and we'd love your input on these different recharge strategies. That'll help us kind of inform some of the work that we do on task 4 as we're moving forward. I think the one thing I wanted to note about the recharge strategies that we've identified so far is I think that we might have constrained strategy number 1, the forecast-informed preemptive releases from Sutherland. The project team's thinking we might have constrained ourselves a little bit too much. And that, supply might be more necessary in dry conditions, which doesn't necessarily jive with that kind of forecast-informed, use the wet water when it's there type of strategy. So we'll have to kind of think through that a little bit more as we're working our way through task 4. But with that set up, Nate, I wanted to pass it on to you to kind of talk a little more about these 4.
Sounds good. My volume okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So yeah, for strategy 1, this is the forecast informed releases from the Sutherland Reservoir. So the idea here, Rosalind alluded to it, but basically you try to adjust or do a good job of forecasting those larger storm events that come through. So more deliberate focus on managing those larger surplus storm flows and timing that in an optimized way to maximize opportunities for groundwater recharge. And so with that, at the bottom of these next few slides, we'll say defined by, all we're meaning by that is just here are some of the things that are going to be used to help provide some definition around that particular strategy. So there we're going to be looking at the historical data as well as simulations on the reservoir operations and releases, and then thinking through things like this, the so-called FIRO approach, that's forecast informed reservoir operations, looking at the historical 15-year period that we included in the GSP, that was water year 2005 through 2019. We'll look over the past, over that 15-year period, and then kind of look at it through the lens of, could it have been operated differently than it was? And so we would be setting up sets of simulations to basically look at the availability of those surface flows in a different way, and then we would be comparing that to the baseline. So that's kind of the concept of how we would look at that particular strategy. Next slide. Okay, stormwater detention in small drainages. So really the strategies 2 through 4 are all similar in concept of what you're ultimately trying to do, which is just change those retention characteristics of stream flow as it enters into the basin. You're wanting to retain more of that to provide opportunities for enhanced groundwater recharge. So in this case, as an example, we may look at things like go down gradient from some of the smaller drainages, where some of those steeper tributaries come into the basin, it kind of flattens off as it hits the basin. Maybe somewhere around those break points, look for things like whether they be spreading grounds, little subcatchments to pool some of that excess water, if there's benefits to doing some things like that. Those would be examples of some of the stormwater detention features. And so, we would be needing to look at, what size events would it even make sense to have some of these things. As you all know, there's a lot of storm events in stream flow where that stream flow is going to infiltrate anyway. So does it make sense to necessarily capture some of that stuff in the upper parts of the basin if ultimately it was going to be recharged anyway? So we'll be thinking about these types of things as we provide some definition around locations, potential locations. Next slide. Let's see, check dams. Same idea. This is just an internet stock photo here, just an example of what check dams can look like. So again, you're just trying to retain, slow the velocity and retain more of that water, slow it down just so you have more opportunity for infiltration. Here we'll be looking at some the USGS stream gauge data and thinking about, which parts of the basin would this even make sense to consider putting in some check dams. But again, the ultimate goal is just that retention, enhanced opportunity for recharge. Next slide. Yeah, and this last one, stream channel modifications. Here would be things like, or does it make sense in some parts of the channels to scour them up? The second bullet, replace lower permeability materials with higher. I don't know that we're going to find a lot of low permeability material in these, but that's just an example of what can be done. But just basically getting out in the stream channel, making some modifications in a way to slow the stream flow, try to take advantage of some of the meanders and things that are out there, maybe connect them up in certain ways or widen them. But we'll be looking at the same USGS stream gauge data for that. And then we're also going to be doing this task 2 stream bed investigation toward the end of June, early July, and then using that information to update the GSP model. So we're going to be using a combination of this information to provide some definition around these potential strategies. Any questions on those?
Does anyone have any feedback on those concepts for our recharge strategies?
I have a question.
Sure.
I have 2 questions, excuse me. On strategy 4 right here, how many permits are going to be needed to do these stream channel modifications? How many permits are going to be needed from how many different organizations? And is it, I assume there might be a CEQA process, Army Corps of Engineers, etc. Is it too cost prohibitive to even to begin to think about?
Those are all great questions, and you'll see in the evaluation criteria that we've developed, we actually have a criteria that we're proposing to use to get it exactly that answer, the feasibility answer in terms of, you know, the number and complexity of permits that would be necessary for the recharge strategies. I think it's worth still exploring the concepts, as long as, you know, the GSA is going in with their eyes wide open on what it'll take to actually implement something.
And earlier there was a mention about creating different holding areas. And maybe I'm jumping the gun over here, but we need to make sure that those holding areas are maintained, that they don't become a growing ground for non-native species, that those non-native species start uptaking and offsetting the water saved going to new plant growth. And so that was just a comment.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about making sure we're not just considering the you know, kind of construction related feasibility in terms of permitting, but also that operational expectations or requirements for the different types of projects. And that's all kind of in the concept of that criterion number 8, the feasibility criterion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Anyone else? All right, so let's move on to the proposed evaluation criteria themselves. So I wanted to start with an overview of the data sources that we anticipate using for these 8 proposed evaluation criteria. And my plan here is to pause at each of the evaluation criteria and get your feedback and kind of have a dialogue with you all about what it is that we're measuring, what's the metric that we're planning on using, you know, what's the certainty or uncertainty, you know, of the information that we'll be using. So any sort of input that you have on these criteria, we welcome that. The tech memo that we sent out, you saw the draft watermark, it's still in draft. So we want to have a conversation about these ideas or potentially other ones if you have them. So you'll see over here on the right that most of the evaluation criteria we're anticipating using that SPV GSP model. And Nate's team, you know, would kind of take that recharge strategy, run it through a model scenario, and output some of the metrics that we need in order to evaluate these different things. We also anticipate down here on the bottom having to just collect some information from the GSAs, the city, the county, and then from Jacobs and Woodard and Curran directly. In some cases, we're going to have to look at the recharge strategy, look at the location, look at the facilities needed to accomplish it, and develop a preliminary cost estimate for that. Based on our professional experience. So there's, you know, some areas, groundwater quality, cost, and feasibility that'll really are a bit more qualitative, and that will take some input from the project team itself. Up here in the upper left-hand corner, we have CWA SIM, and CWA SIM is a systems model that Jacobs has developed. They've used it a number of times for various more regional scale projects, the Water Authority's Facilities Master Plan and Bureau Basin Study, I believe, for the region. And so we anticipate using some of the information from the CWA SIM to get at some of the metrics that we need for criterion 4. Then the last source we see is the GDE Pulse tool. This is a new Nature Conservancy tool that was essentially released right about the time we were finalizing our GSP. And that tool essentially looks at the different vegetation communities in groundwater dependent ecosystems, our GDEs, and it helps us to understand exactly what are the species types in those communities and the rooting depths associated with those. Kind of gives us a little bit more information and helps us to better refine our assessment of benefits to GDEs. So we are planning on using that GDE Pulse tool as part of this assessment. And then any other data sources that you may, have ideas on, we, welcome any input that you all have. So we'll start, one more note that I wanted to make is in the tech memo, if you all read through that, you would see at the back of the tech memo, there's a big table. So it lists all 8 of the evaluation criterion. It includes the metric that we plan to use. What is the specific unit of measurement that we're going to use to understand the success of the different recharge strategies as they relate to these particular criterion. We have a column in there on scoring, and at this point we have not developed specific scoring rubric for these evaluation criteria. And we can't do that yet because we don't know the scale of the information or the scale of the metric that's going to come in for the different types of recharge strategies. So our thought at this point in time is to identify that we'll probably use a forced rank or a category rank type of ranking system. So the forced rank, which is on the left of the screen here, is when there's a range of values that are, you know, distributed pretty evenly across a similar scale. So things like, you know, Russian nesting dolls, where they're pretty evenly distributed and you kind of rank them in order of 1 through 4, and relatively simple way of ranking the 4 different types of strategies. A category rank is when you have values for your metrics that are wildly different. You might have several recharge strategies that really fall within the 1 to 100 acre feet camp, and then others that fall in the 5,000 acre feet camp, excuse me. And so a category rank is a kind of a scoring system that you might use when you have pretty widely different values that you're looking at, and you don't necessarily want to rank them just in rank order. You want to give yourself the ability to, you know, give the star strategy an A and the rest of them a D if they're really that far apart. And so the concept there is kind of letter grades. As we are working through some of the data analysis and evaluating the criterion, have a better sense of where the range of values is, then we'll kind of narrow in on specifically what that scoring rubric is. And of course, we'll bring that back to stakeholders. We'll bring that back to you all as part of a workshop so that you can take a look at that. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions? Okay, so I'm going to move on to criteria number 1. So proposed criteria number 1 is the reduction of model deficit in cumulative storage. And remember, when we met on the annual report in March, I think, we talked about cumulative change in groundwater storage. So this is essentially the volume of storage that we have in San Pasqual Basin and how it changes over time. And you'll recall this graph, we talked about it in March. Oh, sorry about that. And you'll see in the dark blue lines, this is our annual change in storage. These letters here show the different kind of hydrologic year. So you'll see W stands for a wet year. You'll see the W's will often have a positive change in storage, lots of precipitation, lots of recharge, more water in the basin. Whereas when you have critically dry or dry years, we tend to have a negative annual change in storage, right? Where maybe some of the pumping does exceed the amount of precipitation recharging the basin. So you'll see the cumulative change in storage line here in the orange. And what we want to do is we want to model each of the recharge strategies separately to determine how would each of the recharge strategies essentially be forecasted in terms of their cumulative change in storage. What would this line look like moving forward with the different strategies implemented? Does that metric make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any questions about that proposed metric?
It looks like Peter said in the question box that he has a question.
Oh, great. Peter, go ahead. Thanks, Amber, for helping out there.
Yeah, Rosalind, actually, this does make sense to me. My question before we started this, and I'm real slow to type and find the chat box, I apologize, is
No problem.
you have 7 evaluation criteria, and you're talking about how you would score each one, whether it would be rank but how do you combine them all? How do you evaluate all 7 together?
Typically in a scoring process like this, each of the evaluation criterion does get some score from 1 to 4, whether you use a category rank or a force rank for each individual criterion, right? Then each of the 8 would have its own 1 through 4 score, which would add up to a sum. Those would then be weighted. So there would be a some kind of weighting exercise based on importance. Certainly not all of the evaluation criteria are equally important. And that's part of the values exercise that we're going to do a little bit later, is to talk about what's important to all of us, and maybe what's not so important. And yes, it needs to be considered, but maybe not weighted so heavily as some of the other evaluation criteria.
Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you. That's
welcome.
what I'm getting at, was the weighting.
Mhm.
So they're not going to all be equal weight, but the weighting is to be determined.
Exactly. And we haven't done the weighting yet. The weighting will be conducted by the GSA, and that will take into account all of the input that we are doing today as part of the values discussion. Any other questions? All right, so let's move on to item number 2. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through each of the evaluation criteria so that when we get to the values activity, you know, hopefully it'll go a little quicker because we'll have just gone through each one. So proposed criteria number 2 is the maintenance of shallower groundwater levels. And so our proposed metric here is the depth to groundwater at the representative monitoring wells. So you all will recall this map. It was part of the annual report that we talked about in March. Each of the representative monitoring wells is shown here in the little triangles with the depth to groundwater here. And so the intent here is to run each model scenario, which will provide us with an output of the groundwater level contours, and then we'll be able to essentially compare the baseline, right, to the implementation of each of those different recharge strategies and how that affects groundwater levels at the representative monitoring wells. Any questions on that one?
Yeah, I have a question. This is Ricky.
Hi, Ricky.
How would you? There's the existing way back in the day obligation to keep groundwater levels at 20 feet below the ground surface, and I notice here that they're quite a bit below that. In considering number 2, would you include then increasing the groundwater levels up to that 20-foot level?
We hadn't considered that as a specific target, but the modeling will allow us to look specifically at where the forecasted or the simulated groundwater levels do get to, and can certainly compare them to that depth. Did you have any other questions, Ricky?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to number 3. This is the way that we phrased it is the reduction of projected groundwater declines or levels to the minimum thresholds. So you'll recall during the GSP process, we established the sustainable management criteria for ourselves, and we kind of looked at each of the representative monitoring wells, and we looked at what is the minimum threshold under which we do not want groundwater levels to go down to that level. We also established for ourselves a measurable objective. This is really where we'd like groundwater levels to be as often as possible. And that kind of space in between is our margin of operational flexibility, our MOOF, as you'll recall. And the current condition shown here in the purple line kind of moves up and down depending on what type of water year it is, and that kind of good stuff, as you know, basin storage goes up and down. So this particular criterion, the metric would be the avoidance of groundwater levels dropping below those minimum thresholds. And so using the data from criterion number 2, which is where those ground levels are with implementation of the individual recharge strategies, we would look at, do any of the representative monitoring wells go below the MTs? And if so, how often? And so essentially it would be just kind of calculating the amount of time that the different representative, if they do go below them, what is that amount of time? Any questions on that one? Do you have a question on that one?
No.
Okay. All right. So let's go to number 4. So this is efficiency of recharge. This one's a little tougher to grasp, but our metric here is our ratio of the cumulative change in groundwater storage, right? That was the thing that we were measuring in criterion number 1, to the cumulative volume of surface water that is used for recharge. So we're looking at how much water do you have to put into the system, or the bucket in this case, and how much of it is kind of lost in that process, and how much of it actually translate into cumulative change in groundwater storage. So how much actually stays within the basin, and what is the ratio of that amount that you've put in to the amount that you keep in the basin. And so that's looking at things like evapotranspiration and any kind of conveyance or loss out to Hodges Reservoir, things like that. It's kind of trying to assess that efficiency of the recharge strategy itself. Does anybody have any questions on that one? Okay. Number 5 is improvements in groundwater quality. This one is one of the ones on the data page that I said we would, be doing in a little bit more qualitative way. The intent here is to understand how do the different types of recharge strategies, or how could they potentially change groundwater quality at our representative monitoring network wells for groundwater quality. And so we want to think about what is the source of that recharge, the volume of surface water that is coming in, what are the concentrations of TDS and nitrate, and how might that change the mass balance of those constituents in the basin itself. So our metric here is the flow weighted average concentration of TDS and nitrate is nitrogen in the basin based on those different kinds of sources that are coming in, and changes in those sources based on the different types of recharge strategies. We don't, and we're planning on doing those calculations specifically for the groundwater monitoring network wells.
Rosalind?
Yes.
So in the earlier slide, you said that this was something that was going to be evaluated using the groundwater model, but you're not doing solute transport simulations here.
We are not.
What you're doing is you're using the model to determine how much you're releasing, and
Correct.
then you're doing a paper calculation based on what the different water quality of the released water is versus the groundwater.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, so the model's used really on the volume side to help us develop the calculations, and then we'll use the concentrations from those source waters on a flow weighted average analysis.
Hi, Joseph Rivera.
Hi, Joseph.
Hi. Yeah, I think I just wanted a little bit more clarification as well as to how you're calculating the outflow of groundwater or water from water received to the water that's not stored.
Yeah, so that
Into
was
the
evaluation
groundwater.
criterion 4.
Yeah, the last one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how are you calculating the amount that is not contained or preserved into the groundwater?
So outflow to Hodges Reservoir is actually one of our model components. And so that particular number is calculated as part of the model. And then the evapotranspiration of any sort of water that is released will be a calculated figure using either CWA sim or Nate, your BCM portion of the integrated model.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Nate, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you got it right at the end there. Yeah, it's just basically all these flows. This model that we have, it's a physically based, groundwater flow model, so we can get flows and all kinds of flow related information that then you would pair with the water quality data to look at mass fluxes. So yeah, you've got it.
Thanks.
You take into account the amount of or lack of rainwater that we get, correct?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, and all of the kind of hydrologic year projections and all of the kind of precipitation data, all of that was all compiled and is part of the SPV GSP model and does incorporate the kind of climate change projections in future years.
Peter here again.
Mhm.
So that has just triggered another question for me. You're looking at the TDS of the source water, whether it's rainfall or a release from Sutherland,
Mhm.
looking at the groundwater data. Are you factoring in, as the rainfall on the broader areas of the valley goes through the fields and whatnot and picks up TDS and nitrate, carrying it to the groundwater? How are you factoring that in?
We have surface water data that we collected as part of the GSP development process, and that includes water quality data. I think they're at the USGS gauges. So I believe, and Nate, you can jump in if I'm incorrect here, that the intent is to is for those surface waters where we're, anticipating some sort of, diversion or retention type facility, that we would be using that USGS water quality data for the surface flows that we have.
Yeah, I think the idea is to start with that water year 2005 through 2019. So it'd be using those historical data sets. You run your baseline. Those historical water quality data are what they are. And then we'd be looking at, for any given strategy, just what source water would be different in terms of a volume, a water quantity into the basin. And then we would just attach a concentration to those and just see, in a very general sense, qualitative, kind of that mass balance calculation of just does that provide an opportunity for some improvement in groundwater quality? So it is not meant to look at a per field basis of runoff. It's not that granular. It's more of a kind of a big picture. If there's changes in source flows and they have a certain concentration that tends to be associated with them, does that stand to potentially improve groundwater quality or not?
Yeah, okay. I guess one potential issue is that there's probably a difference in the amount of TDS and nitrate in the vadose beneath the creek as opposed to under the fields and orchards. And and that's continuing as water flows through the vadose to migrate down to the groundwater. And so that there would be potentially a differential transport from the vadose zone beneath the creek and beneath the other areas that I don't think you will be able to capture with what you're talking about doing.
Correct. It's absolutely more complicated than what we just described. Without a solute transport model, we certainly wanted to have a criterion that had something to do with groundwater quality, and this just seemed adequate for kind of this first level surface water recharge evaluation. There's other processes too, as you're well aware. The evapoconcentration effect. That's really a complex thing as well. So we're not looking for this particular criterion at a lot of those details, but more of just, are there differences in the way flows would be reporting to the basin? And if you attach a concentration to those, scramble them up in a blender, if you will, just does it stand to provide any improvements? And it's just a qualitative, high level kind of a check. And this would be a good example, like with the weighting criteria as you get to the end, things like this, it's obviously a different animal as compared with the other criterion, and it can be weighted accordingly.
We've taken some good notes about this, this concept of the kind of veto zone contributor to groundwater quality, Peter. So we can also kind of put our heads together and see if there's any sort of refinement that we can do to this evaluation criteria based on that. I know we've got some folks internally that do that type of work, certainly not my wheelhouse, but we'll pull in some folks to see if, to think about this a little bit more. Thanks for the comment.
Hi, sorry, just another Joseph, just to add on again. Are you taking into account or are in contact with the the local agriculture as to how much fertilizer or additional I know you guys are taking nitrogen and other TDS materials, but are you in contact with those agricultural groups as to how much they're adding into their private areas? Or are you just measuring the output of nutrients from those areas?
So we certainly have farmers that participate in these workshops and, are kind of partners in the GSP itself, the development and implementation of the GSP. We have some projects, we'll talk a little bit later about kind of overall GSP implementation. We have some management actions that have to do with, kind of outreach around TDS and nitrate loading to the basin and things like that. But I don't think, and Sandra, I don't know if you know this, that we've ever done any sort of polling or anything of the specific amount of fertilizers that are applied. There was some calculations of volume, I think, in the salt and nutrient management plan back in 2015, I think it was. But we as a group haven't done any of that kind of polling, and we're really depending on the surface water and groundwater quality sampling that's been done to understand the impacts or the characteristics of those water sources.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's move on to number 6. So here are potential benefits to GDEs, groundwater dependent ecosystems, and you'll recall this map from the planning process, the GSP process, where we looked at the riparian and wetland habitats throughout the valley and kind of compared those to average rooting depths for the species themselves, and where is it that those particular vegetation communities could access groundwater versus maybe accessing some other kind of just the surface water within those particular channels. So we kind of divided the basin into halves, if you will. You'll see that the green dots here are showing the kind of riparian and wetland vegetation that doesn't appear to have access to any sort of groundwater supply. And then those potential GDEs in the blue on the left that do have access to shallow groundwater. As part of the GSP, we're actually doing some work to refine this analysis, where we're taking a look at the new GDE Pulse tool that I was telling you about, and we're taking a harder look at the specific plant species that are within these wetland and riparian communities within the basin, and refining the assessment of the specific kind of coverage of the GDEs in our basin. So we are also kind of as a parallel effort implementing that additional desktop study of GDEs. That particular desktop study will be done before the modeling of all of our scenarios here in this recharge strategy. So once we have our modeling completed for our recharge strategies, we'll be able to take those groundwater levels and compare those to the rooting depths of GDEs within the basin. We'll have a better sense of coverage and rooting depth of all of those species. So that is our metric, is really looking at that depth to groundwater at the representative monitoring wells that are located in that western portion of the basin, or wherever the refined coverage for our GDEs is. But we anticipate that it'll be this western portion of the basin, and comparing those to the refined rooting depths. There's also a separate task, I think it was task 6, that was specifically benefits to GDEs. So I think in that particular task, we'll probably explore some additional kind of plant health type criteria, or at least discussion of plant health, you know, and how often can groundwater levels go below the rooting zone and still maintain healthy GDE communities. So that type of analysis will be contained in task 6, but maybe won't be quantified as part of the quantification, or excuse me, as part of the evaluation criteria. This one we have, you know, a more clear metric. All right, 2 more to go. We've got number 7. This is cost of implementation of maintenance. So what we expect to be able to do is to look at the recharge strategies once they're defined, develop a cost, a capital cost associated with construction, as well as an ongoing annual cost or for operations and maintenance, O&M, and to be able to essentially develop a unit cost per acre foot for each of the different recharge strategies, and then we can kind of compare those costs against one another. This is a very common way of looking at the feasibility of projects, where you're kind of comparing different capital project alternatives against one another.
Rosalind?
Yes.
Peter, sorry. This is the cost. There's also a benefit that you should also estimate, which is, you know, one of your earlier criteria is how often do we go below minimum thresholds?
Mm-hmm.
And should the GSA take action because the basin is falling below minimum thresholds to reduce pumping for agriculture, that you guys should estimate per acre foot of decreased economic, decrease in agricultural production and the associated benefit and revenue that generates.
Yeah,
So,
kind of an avoided cost analysis.
Yeah, so you've got a cost here, but the benefit is offsetting a loss of economic growth or economic revenue. I mean, if you cut a farmer back 10%, his revenue and the food that's going to the community is decreased by an amount, and that has a cost, a value.
That's a great suggestion, Peter. It's oftentimes in feasibility assessment. I know, for example, through the Bureau of Reclamation, I write a lot of feasibility studies for recycling projects, and we not only do a cost analysis, but we also kind of look at those economic benefits and avoided costs of implementing the different strategies. So that's a great suggestion. Thank you. Ricky, looks like you have a question as well.
Yeah, in looking at your 3.7 there, one-time capital, how would you evaluate the cost of releasing water from Sutherland? There's no capital facility needed.
Yeah, that'll be tricky. I think that's something that we need to work through as we are developing the strategy itself in task 4, where we are doing a more detailed assessment of the kind of operational agreements associated with Sutherland. I know there are a couple of different agencies who access water. I think Ramona is the other one that accesses water from that particular reservoir. So I think once we get a better handle on what those institutional arrangements look like, then we'll be able to figure out how to cost that out.
Okay, and the second question is, there's also environmental benefits. There's conservation benefits. Your GDEs benefit, they become healthier. How are you going to include those rather intangible things like benefit to the environment and benefit to conservation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you have any ideas on how we might do that?
I am not an economist, Rosalind.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes we look at environmental projects from kind of an ecosystem services perspective. What kind of services is your restoration project providing? Well, it's providing, a habitat benefit, which are the GDEs. It's providing a water quality improvement benefit, which we've got captured. It's providing, those kinds of ecosystem services. So, maybe there's a way for us to either expand the GDEs criteria or develop one specific to ecosystem services. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. And I know we had Dan Silver, I think, and Conservancy involved. So maybe I'll kind of do some reaching out and see if any of our environmentally oriented partners have any thoughts on that.
A little comment here too, which is this goes to the weighting, which you guys have already anticipated, and I now understand, because it's when you have things that are real soft, like the GDEs, or we're going to have this much more water in the basin. First, something which everybody can get, which is real hard. It's going to cost $500 foot. Now, there's a tendency to say, okay, the $500 an acre foot is more tangible, and try to avoid giving it too much weight because it's so quantitative.
I see what you mean. It is sometimes easier to value the things that you can calculate a little more than the intangibles. And that's one of the ways that we kind of do weighting is, you don't just look at the whole list of all of the criteria and kind of divide up your points or your 100% amongst those. You kind of look at them criterion by criterion. What's more important to me? Is it, the cost or the GDEs? What's more important to me? Is it the groundwater levels or the groundwater quality? And so, kind of trying to dissect how we're looking at the different criterion will help us to formulate a weighting that I think still values all of, those intangibles. Any other comments before we move on to the last one? All right, last one is feasibility of implementation and maintenance. And Frank, this aligns with the comments that you had made earlier about kind of the permitting. So we You know, we anticipate, yes, each of, you know, those in-stream types of projects would require, you know, Army Corps of Engineers permits and California Fish and Wildlife permits and Endangered Species Act compliance with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And so all of those things, based on the different recharge strategies and the locations that are identified in Task 4, we'll try to, you know, kind of estimate the number and difficulty of acquisition of those permits, any sort of institutional agreements or challenges that we can identify associated with the different recharge strategies, and then schedule and timeline. Those are kind of the common feasibility items that we look at. Any other thoughts on criterion 8? Okay, so this is my last slide on the presentation of our proposed criteria. Any other thoughts before we move on to the values activity? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Peter again. I'm not sure where to make this comment, but you're using the groundwater model to evaluate a number of these criteria. I mean, 5 of them, I think. And you're going to be collecting more data about the infiltration capacity of the streams and whatnot. So I think it's critical that when those data are collected and incorporated in the model, and the model is recalibrated with those data, that there be a technical memorandum that goes out so that everybody can see, you know, how the model is performing now, because so many of these answers come out of the model.
Right.
How much flows out, how much is rejected, how much is transpired, and well, at least by crops. So I think it's really important that there be a technical memo that goes out so there can be public review and comment before we use it to undertake these evaluations. Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Peter. Yeah, we understand, and we're not sure how the outcomes of the stream bed characteristics work, the field work. We are not sure at this point if and how it could change the model if the outcomes of that field work are very similar to the assumptions that we had made or not, and may have a pretty significant impact. So at this point, we haven't included a tech memo like that in the scope. Right now, we have a tech memo on the results of the stream bed characteristics work, but not necessarily an update of the model.
Okay.
Well, if it's needed, then we can talk about it at the next workshop when we present the task 2 work.
Okay, I just would refer back to previous comments that I've made and the response that the model was, yeah, sorry about my comments, but.
No, we understand your perspective.
I'm a gear. And I have a beanie with a propeller. But one of the responses was that the model was only being used for providing sort of water balance. Now the model is being used very specifically to evaluate that. And that's why I think it's appropriate for this. And I'm really happy that you're collecting, you know, going out to the field and collecting more data. But I do think it's really important that it gets reported out in the technical memo, what, you know, the revisions to the model. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so let's move on to the Menti. So the easiest way I've found to do this is to take your cell phone and to open the camera and to use the QR code that's right here to open Menti on your phone. That way you can see my screen, you can see what's happening in the presentation, but you can also cast your, you know, put your opinion into the polls that we're using through the Menti program. If the QR code doesn't work for you, go ahead and open Menti, www.menti.com, and enter the code, which is listed here, 13165271. Amber, if you wouldn't mind, can you put a link to the Menti in the chat and then also put the code in there, just in case it's easier for folks. So the purpose of this activities, of the values activity, is to understand what's important to you. So, you know, in developing these evaluation criteria, we've kind of went through the list of things that we think are important to consider as we're evaluating each of the different recharge strategies and what we think might be the most successful recharge strategy for San Pasqual Basin. But we want to understand what's important to you. We also want to understand why. So the Menti is going to give us a chance to kind of poll you and see, okay, this one is really important to everyone. And we need to make sure that we're, you know, really focused on that particular criterion. But if you could either add into the chat or verbalize or send us some follow-up comments and kind of talk to us about why is it important to you or not important to you, or why are you, you know, kind of neutral about this particular criteria. That would be really helpful for us in kind of wrapping up the weighting portion of the tech memo. You saw, if you looked at the tech memo, that we left it blank and we kind of said, hey, we're not really ready to do this yet because we haven't talked to our stakeholders about what's important to them. So I am going to put the Menti up here. And I am going to proceed to the first evaluation criterion. So if you have Menti open, your screen should have moved to this first criterion. So I'm going to open the voting here. And if you could vote for us, you should have three options that you can click on the circles, whether the reduction of the modeled deficit in cumulative storage, if this is important to you, you're neutral about it, or not important. I am going to start let's do a 1-minute countdown for this first one while you kind of get oriented to Menti, figure out how to do cast your vote. Is anyone having any issues getting onto the Menti?
Excuse me, Rosalind. On our end, it appears to be saying voting is closed. Please ask the presenter to open voting.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can't submit it,
Yes.
unfortunately. We can choose it, but we can't submit it.
Oh, that's
Yeah, mine's the same
interesting.
thing.
So, hold on. Voting should be open on my end. Is
There
it
we
not?
go. Got
There
it.
we go. It's good. It's good to go now.
Oh, good. I just needed to toggle it. I have 22 participants on this call. I think if I get 15 to 20 responses, of course, I'm not going to vote, and Amber's not, and Nate's not, your consulting team isn't going to. But if the rest of you could, that would be helpful for us to understand.
Rosalind, this is Nate. When I've used Menti, it's completely anonymous, right? It's just simply going to tally results. It doesn't say who they came from. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's completely anonymous.
Yep.
And at this point, I've actually hidden all of the results. Once I close the voting for each criterion, I'll show you all the results. Looks like I've only got 12 votes so far. Let's do 30 seconds more, see if I can get bump that number up at least above 15.
And Rosalind, it's Julie here. I think we had discussed previously that if people were having trouble using the Menti, that you would still accept votes in an email form later on.
Absolutely, yes. So if you have any difficulty with getting onto the Menti, or if it's not working for you, just send Stacy an email. Just let her know that you weren't able to vote, and we'll include those in the tally. Okay, so So we have clearly the reduction of modeled deficit and cumulative storage is really important to folks there. Does anyone want to speak to this one? I know that's the purpose of a groundwater sustainability plan, right? To keep water in the basin so that it stays sustainable. All right, let's move on to the next one. I am going to, this is maintenance of shallower groundwater levels. Sometimes when I move the slide forward, you might have to catch up. At the very top of your screen, it might say, move to the presenter's slide, and that'll give you the ability to vote on the next criterion. Everyone caught up with item 2, criterion 2, maintenance of shallower groundwater levels? All right, we've got 25 seconds. Amber, did you note how many I had the last one? I think it was 14.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
Whoops. Can you open it back up? I was just about to hit the vote button.
Oh, no problem. There you go. Go ahead and add yours in.
Thank
And
you.
Ricky, I can hear some feedback from your line. So
I'll close it off.
if you're not talking, that'd be great. All right, has everyone voted on 2? All right, let's see. Interesting. So the maintenance of shallower groundwater levels actually is heavier in the neutral category. Does anyone want to speak to that? Keeping more water in the basin is important. But maybe there's a kind of a sub areas that need shallower groundwater, whereas maybe other sub areas don't need it so much. For example, that far western end, which is already pretty shallow. Like I said, we'd love to have a little more dialogue about each of these and why these things are showing up as important or not important to you. So any comments or thoughts that you might have, we'd love them now or as a follow-up. Okay, let's move to the next one. I'm going to open voting on this one, and this is the reduction in projected groundwater declines to the minimum thresholds. So this is where we were looking at how many times, if it does, how many times and how often do groundwater levels dip below those minimum thresholds? So we'll start our 30-second countdown.
Rosalind, I may ask you to restate that question or explain it slightly different. I think I understand what it means, but I'm not 100% sure.
So remember, we established minimum thresholds for ourselves, which were the line in which we did not want our groundwater levels to go below. And then when we have our projects and management actions, we kind of used these, we established triggers where we said, if our groundwater levels go below our minimum thresholds for a certain amount of time, I think it was, I can't remember, 24 months, at 30% of our representative wells, then we will start initiating some of our tier 1 and tier 2 management strategies. And so those minimum thresholds are pretty important. They're what DWR uses to essentially evaluate if we have a sustainable basin. this metric essentially looks at what are the simulated groundwater levels at our representative network under each of the different recharge strategies that we're going to model, and do any of those groundwater levels essentially dip down below that minimum threshold line. Was that what you needed, Frank?
I was following you along perfectly fine till the last second, the last 5 seconds.
Sure.
Basically, what I'm understanding this as is how important is it that we reduce the number of times that we dip below the minimum threshold?
Correct.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of
have a duration associated with it.
stated in a negative, but yes, but it does account for duration.
It's almost another restatement of the first question.
It is similar, but it uses the MTs as a very specific threshold. Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
It uses the data from the first one for sure, or from the second one. Okay, I've got 11. Anyone else going to weigh in on this one? All right, so results are 100% important, and agree with you there, because this is really what defines sustainability. In the way that DWR has characterized this, implementation of the Sigma program, we must be above our minimum thresholds. So I think, I'd agree with you all that this is really the most important of our criteria. So let's move on to number 4, efficiency of recharge. And remember, this is kind of looking at that ratio of how much water is coming in versus how much water is actually staying as storage in the basin, and kind of accounting for the losses that are happening in evapotranspiration and outflows to Hodges. So we have, voting is open. And I've started our timer, 30 seconds. And I've already got 12 votes, which is as many as I had last time. There's 13. Right, our results are pretty heavily weighted here on important. The efficiency of that recharge is important to folks. You wouldn't want to waste that water supply. Okay, number 5 is improvements in groundwater quality. And remember, our metric is trying to calculate if any of these, how these recharge strategies might improve groundwater quality by adding new supplies in. So you should be able to vote, and I will start our countdown. Boy, whoever watches this video later on, all this silence, it's gonna be boring. I wonder if I could have Micah like fast forward all of the pauses. All right, I've got 13 folks that have weighed in on this one. Does anybody else want to? All right, here's our results. So interestingly, improvements to groundwater quality, you got a lot more kind of neutral, not really important to me, not unimportant to me, part of the equation.
Well, I think it's more, you don't want to contaminate the soil, obviously, or the groundwater, but you know, there's all treatability capabilities at the end of the day. So whether you decide to, I think the sustainability is the key. If it's maybe causing more treatment on the back end, that might be what is important or neutral to people. Because if people can, if it's more sustainable and you can treat it, then, you know, the sustainability is the big thing, I think.
That's a really great point, Marisa. Part of the management actions that we're implementing for the overall GSP is better communication and kind of education about treatment options for example, domestic wells that might have higher nitrate or TDS levels, and you know, kind of what do you need to be thinking about and what could you do about it, and so kind of educating on that treatability piece of that equation. Thanks for weighing in there. Number 6 is the potential benefits to GDEs. So I have opened voting, and I'll start our countdown. So interestingly, I'm seeing fewer votes come in on this one. So rather than just choosing neutral, I'm having folks not voting at all, which I find is really interesting. Does anybody else want to vote on criterion 6, potential benefits to GDEs?
Could you open the voting again, please? Oh,
Sure. Open, the voting should be open. There we go, there's 12. We're back up to our typical numbers. Is that everybody?
Sorry, it looks like when I refreshed, it's requiring me to re-enter the code. Would you mind giving me the code again, please?
Sure, it's 13165271.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure. And then at the top, you might have a little button that says jump to the presenter slide. Lonnie, let me know when you're able to vote. I don't want to move on until you've had a chance.
It looks like it did capture my vote earlier, so I'm good.
Okay, awesome. So here's our results. Somewhat evenly spread between important, neutral, and not important. Similar to our groundwater quality discussion, Marisa, this might be more in line with, hey, let's keep the basin sustainable. And if we do that, the GDEs will be supported.
Right. I mean, there's value added, obviously, if there's a potential benefit. I mean, I guess there's so many things that are important, but the sustainability by far outweighs, and in some ways you can't, it's all important, right? And it's to each individual on what that importance is, and that's the basis of your, you know, the slides and suggestions. But I think overall, if you can get to the water and you can continue to get to the water, I mean, that's ultimately that's the goal.
Right. I mean, that'll support all the beneficial uses in the basin.
Correct. And so,
and the domestic users and the GDEs.
But that's what's going to be interesting on the weighing of each of these items. It's like, okay, so, you know, where do you weigh the higher the importance, right? Or how do you make those weighting criteria balanced with so many, you know, with so many people utilizing it?
Right. Okay, let's move on to 7. Here's the cost of implementation and maintenance.
Now, who is the cost and implementation and maintenance borne by? Is it all of the users? How is that interpreted?
The cost estimates that we were planning on developing were really the kind of city's cost of implementing a potential recharge strategy. So if in fact it's determined that there is one that's feasible and preferred and recommended for moving forward, what would it cost to construct and maintain that particular strategy? So we weren't necessarily looking at indirect costs associated with any sort of other users in the basin. But that was that suggestion from Peter, which was, you know, kind of you do need to look at the avoided costs of implementing some of these strategies. So if the MPs go down and all of those other things are all of the, you know, pumping reductions in tier 2 are implemented, what would be those costs that we're avoiding by doing this particular activity? And so we'll think about how we can calculate that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I've got 12. Anybody else want to weigh in here? Okay, here's our results. So this is pretty evenly spread as well in terms of costs, and you know, with the greatest number being in the not important. This one's tough because often cost is not important to the people that don't have to pay. But I think it's, you know, a really good idea to balance that with, you know, the avoided costs, because, you know, those are other folks that'll have to contribute. So the last one is the feasibility of implementation of maintenance, and this is, you know, kind of the assessment of permitting and institutional challenges that would go along with implementation of the recharge strategies. We've got 11. Oh, there we go. There's 13. I think that's everybody. And this is our last criteria. So the results here are important. The feasibility considerations are really important. So we're going to compile all of this information. This will be all kind of presented as part of that section of the tech memo when we add the additional revisions in based on kind of the thoughts that you offered us today. We'll include this data in that section on weighting and kind of how this exercise and the input that everyone's provided has contributed to the weighting that we are proposing to use moving forward. So we'll compile all of this and we'll get that sent out. I'll probably compile it and maybe include it as, you know, as a handout in the next workshop or something like that, so that you all have access to the information.
Would you be able to send a link to the recorded meeting as well?
Of course, yeah. So after every workshop, we post the recording on the county website, which is our program website. And so you'll have access to that along with meeting notes once we get those wrapped up.
All right, great. Thank you.
Close out of this, and I'm going to move us through just the last couple of slides in our presentation, and then we will be ready to wrap up. Oh, before we do that, I wanted to offer anyone a chance for public comment. Is there any comments that you all want to offer that maybe, you know, we haven't on a topic we haven't talked about in some of the slides that we've presented? We're really focused today strictly on our surface water recharge evaluation criteria, but is there, any other comments that you want to offer? This is the time to do so.
This is Ricky. I've got a comment. And I think it's, sitting here and looking at, we've got to do the cost benefit, and then we also have to look at the sustainability. And we also have to look at the people who are directly affected, which of course are the farmers who use the water. So I think one thing that we are very concerned about is I'd hate to see the cost or something like that be the reason that water isn't released from Sutherland in the middle of a drought. The sustainability of the businesses in the valley is important, as important perhaps as what the cost is. So I do hope that you do expand criteria 1 when you're looking at releasing water from Sutherland. I hope you do expand that. I think it's really important to the overall long-term ability to do business in the valley.
Thanks, Ricky.
Rosalind?
Peter?
I'm not sure whether I should make this comment now or in the PowerPoint or the slides about the field work, but on page 7 of the tech memo, in the second paragraph, there's a statement that you're going to run the model with daily stress periods to better capture the infiltration of the surface water. But then understanding that could lead to long run times, when you do the simulations into the future, you're going to revert to monthly stress periods in your evaluations. And I think that it's important that you run, if you're doing the 15-year period with daily time steps with the revised infiltration conductivities, you also run it with the monthly stress period so that you can compare the results, so that you're capturing by going to daily stress periods, the mechanics of what's going on with surface water better than with groundwater. But you got to make sure that you get the same result when you revert to monthly stress periods. So if you could make sure that you do at least one pair so that you get the same results in terms of change in storage with daily stress periods as you do with monthly stress periods. Thanks.
Yeah, the idea of comparing apples to apples. Nate, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, listening to the comments. So yeah, the stress periods and the run times are definitely on my mind. We're looking at probably ending up with a bit of a hybrid. And by that, I mean, for those long stretches where there's no precip or stream flow, we're not going daily. Just because the run times they just simply are too prohibitive. We can't have multi-day run times just to get a single run completed. So we're setting up basically and kind of working through is looking at the historical stream flow records. And for those months where there's enough stream flow, we would then discretize that down to daily for that particular month, as there's stream flow, and it would gradually, so in other words, you kind of decrement and then increment our bites, if you will, through time, depending on stream flow. And just that's going to be our strategy, to just get these so that they can actually run in a reasonable time frame, but we're getting that daily discretization, when it matters, when stream flow is actually there.
Yeah, it's Peter. Nate, that makes sense to me. But I do think you do not need to do daily time steps when there's nothing in the creek.
Right.
Or not time steps, stress periods, but you do make the comparison. So between treating the month in the run where you do it daily compare that to one where you just do it monthly because you're planning to do only monthly for your 67-year looks into the future, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to look at run times. And so, yeah, these are the concepts at the beginning, just anticipating. We've done some tests of different run times. And, you know, if you go daily for the historical period, it's like 3.5 days, you know,
Yeah.
and that was just purely if we just took our monthly stress periods and then just added time steps within those stress periods that was equal to the number of days in the month as just a test case, you know, without varying all the inputs. Yeah, it took 3.5 days. Then we did the same for the historical and future run. And that would be 14 days. So you just can't do it. So
Yeah, I've been there.
yeah, totally. I know you get it. So yeah, we're open to ideas, but yeah, that was just a concept at the beginning, and we hope that as we get into this, we'll see some other opportunities to streamline that a bit. And yeah, certainly appreciate your comment here. I totally see where you're coming from.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, Nate.
Mhm.
Does anyone else have any public comment? Okay, hearing none. The rest of our slide deck really has to do with next steps. And so we wanted to speak to you about, remember when we were looking at our schedule for the surface water recharge evaluation, and I said, okay, we're going to start tasks 2 and 3, and we want to come back to you in September and talk about our findings for those 2 tasks. So Nate's going to tell us a little bit about the work that his team will be doing on those 2 tasks over the course of the next couple of months.
Yeah, okay. So as it mentions here, task 2, our stream bed investigations. So we're looking to do basically 3 different types of activities. Showing a map here, we've got 5 different, what we're calling transect locations. Those are the yellow symbols there, the T1 through T5, primarily focusing on the Santa Isabel Creek, given that that's the main, you know, surface water corridor through that eastern part of the basin where you have the greatest opportunity for recharge. And so at each of those locations, we're going to start with stream channel surveying. We've got ODA consultants that are going to be performing that work. We're looking to begin that work at the end of the month, at the end of June. And basically the idea is at each of those locations or near those locations shown, we still need to work out some access agreements and things that with the city. But each of those spots, there'll be a transect. Picture nominally maybe a couple 100-foot long transect, which is just a line perpendicular to the flow of the river, so kind of cutting across the river channel. And they would just be surveying a series of points along those, so we get a good accurate depiction of what the shape of that cross section of that channel looks like. You may recall during the GSP, that version of the model, in that first version, we just set up things more simply and just had a rectangular channel rather than kind of these irregular shapes, because we just didn't have a lot of in-stream information. So the idea here is to take some of this information and get away from that approach to have rectangular channels, and we'll have what's called an 8-point definition of the bottom of that stream channel. So kind of take those shapes and incorporate them as best we can in the model so that for the higher flows, it actually has a greater wetted perimeter, greater wetted width, and more opportunity for recharge. So the idea is to do a more realistic job, a better job of kind of capturing just those stream dynamics as stream flow is available. So we start with a survey. Based on the survey, we will then try to pick at each of those transect locations 3 points to do infiltration testing. And that's going to consist of double ring infiltrometer testing. Thank you. I forgot those were there. So yeah, there's the kind of the idea of those little points along the stream profile. But once we have those, we want to check those out and identify 3 locations at each transect. And so we'd want to have one that's kind of in the inferred load flow channel, the Thaweg, you know, right at the bottom point, and then step out and say the right or left direction to kind of maybe the next level stream flow event, but we wanted to get a couple of points at each location just so we had a nice data set with which to do some averaging and things of that nature. So we'll have infiltration rates in situ in the stream channel at each of those points. We'll have 15 of those, 3 at each of the 5 shown. And as I mentioned, yeah, just that graphic on the bottom left, that's what a double ring infiltrometer looks like. And it just kind of measures that infiltration rate on that inner ring. Be looking at a number of those tests. And then we can relate that back to some of the assumptions made in the model regarding that infiltration capacity. And so we'll get that report. That's Atlas that's performing that work for us. Early July, I think, is when we'll be hopefully wrapping that up. This last one is really weather dependent. The idea there is you go out after selected rainfall events when you suspect there should be enough rainfall, enough intensity and duration that there should be stream flow. And you go out with a GPS enabled camera and you try to document, where along the stream there, what's kind of the downstream terminus of where stream flow exists. Where does that stream flow finally disappear into the sand? And it's just, I've taken this approach on other Southern California projects with aerial photos and what have you. And that's a really nice thing if you can get some information on that, some aerial photography, just visual evidence of, hey, generally just certain size events, just how far does stream flow make it? And it's just a nice kind of basin scale way of viewing all the complexities that can happen in the stream channel at any given location. Sometimes the decision scale is actually more kind of zoomed out, like we're looking at it on this image, and just generally how far does stream flow make it, given that we don't really have the opportunity in the basin everywhere that we would like to have stream gauges because they're dry a lot of the time. So that's the concept in terms of the task 2 and the types of information we plan to use to update the SPV GSP model. And then Rosalind, were you doing this one or me?
Can I make?
Oh, please go ahead.
Can I make a comment on the last slide?
Sure.
I'm really glad you're doing this. This looks good, and I have, of course, I have a suggestion.
Yeah, please.
Perhaps, waiting for the rain event would be great, but perhaps you could arrange to have one of the wells near the creek pumped for 24 hours and just discharged to the creek so that you can monitor the infiltration. Pump 100 gallons a minute for 24 hours and you can see how far it gets and put up a couple of, try to measure the flow at different locations to see how much it infiltrates. So you don't have to wait for the weather, for the rain. And I'm pretty sure the ranch would cooperate with you on that.
Thanks, Peter.
Are folks okay with the general locations? I'll say the way we kind of identified those was I first just generally looked from Isabel Creek Road back to the inflow point of the basin, and it was nominally about 5 river miles. And so kind of looked at this in terms of about every river mile or so, getting some of this information. And originally had them all on Santa Isabel all the way down to Isabel Creek Road. But then we started thinking about, well, could there be potential things that could be done where the Cuajito it merges up, with the Santa Isabel, and so that's why T5 is kind of up where it is. But these are just concepts. So I mean, I'd be curious, just are folks okay with the general layouts of where we plan to do this? Does it make sense to everyone?
Well, it's the part of the basin where the groundwater levels are the deepest. So this is where and it's the high energy end of the creek reach. So you have coarser sediments, and you have freeboard to allow water in for the future. So it makes a lot of sense to me.
Good. Okay.
Matt, I know you'll recognize a number of these sites. And the city either has or will be reaching out to you to start coordinating on that, on access. Task 3 will essentially look at all of the different potential water sources that could be used for the recharge strategies. So we're looking at things like Nate explained earlier, we're assessing the releases and the operation of Sutherland Reservoir. We're looking at stormwater runoff volumes within the basin and the differences in volume across the different tributaries within the basin. We're using CWA SIM, which is that systems model, as the foundation for understanding the surface reservoir and hydrology associated with those Sutherland releases. And then, of course, looking at operational rules, commitments and agreements, priority setting, things like that. So this is all of the potential water sources, really defining the volume and timing of all of those sources and the potential for using those particular sources of water. That'll help then inform the specific locations and types of strategies that we move forward in the next task 4. Nina, I don't know if you want to speak any more to CWA SIM. I gave a high-level overview.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone has questions on it. I'm less familiar with that particular tool, but we have folks on our team that, like Paula might still be on the call. We developed that and have used it periodically for the Water Authority. But yeah, does anyone have any questions on it? There's some operational rules and things built into it. So yeah, I'll be looking at ways, I guess the idea that as I'm picturing this, the way we're using models in this case is, and I think it's a good use of the models, is we're not focused so much on absolutes, but differences. So in all cases, we're running a baseline. We're going to include the sub-monthly time stepping where it makes sense, but we're essentially running that same historical 2005 through 2019 period. And then we're just going to implement changes in boundary conditions that reflect whatever the strategy is. And we're running the exact same thing again. So if there are biases, and every model has them, that's in the baseline, it's going to also be inherent in any of the other strategy runs. The idea is we're trying to isolate the effect of that run by doing 2 runs and always taking the difference to really try to isolate the difference between them. And so that's the kind of information that will feed into the criterion.
Paula, I see you turning your video on as well.
Yeah, thank you. So just what Nate was describing was precisely what we call the scenario planning. So we can run with this model different operational scenarios. So one of those will be precisely having these releases from Sutherland. So we will be able to see what the impact is, not only to the inflows that get to the groundwater basin, but also making sure that the system is not impacted by those. When I mean the system, the water authorities and the city's water supply system is not impacted by those additional releases. So we've used this model for the San Diego Basin study, for rural reclamation, and also for different planning efforts for the water authority.
Thanks, Paula. All right, and then this is just a quick overview of overall San Pasqual Valley GSP implementation. We wanted to just acknowledge that there are actually 6 management strategies that the GSAs are in the process of implementing. So of all of the, the management strategies that we included in the GSP itself, these 6 are kind of ongoing or underway. You'll see that 3 of them, MA3, which is support for the water quality improvement plan actions, MA4, which is coordinate and collaborate regionally with other entities to perform monitoring and implementation of regional projects, and then MA6, coordinate with the city on Hodges watershed improvement project. All of those are ongoing, where the city's PUD teams are working with the stormwater teams to implement the various activities associated with those programs. And then we've got management action 5, which is education and outreach for TDS and nitrate. And I kind of alluded to this one earlier, that we are working on some of this material that was outlined in management action 5. We're working on a brochure that kind of speaks to TDS and nitrate in groundwater and what domestic users specifically might need to know and do about those constituents in their groundwater supply. As you know, Management Action 7 is underway. That's the topic of this workshop. And then I also mentioned earlier that Management Action 8, which is the study, the groundwater dependent ecosystems, phase 1 desktop study. That's also a study that we're in the process of kicking off right now, where we're refining the coverage of those GDE mapping that we did. We're getting a better handle on the specific vegetation and plant types associated with our GDEs here in the basin. And that all of that work will be done by the end of 2022 so that it can inform the assessment of GDEs under the different recharge strategies. So Julie, I don't know if you had any other thoughts you wanted to add to the implementation updates.
I can talk a little bit about management action number 6. So we have a contractor on board that's going to be working on our Hodges Watershed Improvement Project, and will be beginning the restoration part of our project, where we'll be doing clearing of invasive vegetation and then trying to replant with natives. A huge thank you to Matt Whitman, who has been cooperating with us. We thank you very much. We wouldn't be able to do it without your support. And that's about where we are with that. We'll only have a lot more to report in a few months. We're going to be beginning around September 15th. So we'll actually start seeing how that's progressing by our stakeholder meeting in winter.
September 16th, right? The day after nesting season ends.
That's it. Thank you. Yes, yes.
Where in the basin is that restoration project? It must be on the east side if you're partnering with Matt.
East side around Bandy Canyon, yes.
Okay, so Nate, that actually begs for me, let's make sure that our proposed sites are maybe are not the same sites as the restoration project where we're going to be doing our field work.
Yep, sounds good.
Right. Last couple of slides are just our basics. Here's our overview of GSP resources. This I left in there just to make it easy for you if while you're reviewing any of our presentations you think, oh, I'd really like to look at that annual report. Well, here's the links to the GSP website, the GSP itself, the annual report, and then how to access the OPTI system. Remember, our data management system includes all of the data that we compiled for the plan itself and then added to with the annual report. And then finally, as I said previously, we're planning to address tasks 2 and 3 at the next workshop. And we have a tentative date set of Thursday, September 22nd from 1 to 3 p.m. So I hope that date works for everybody. It's after school's back in, so we should all be around, not on summer vacation anymore. Thanks so much. I think that was my last slide. Yes. I'll leave it there so to make sure that you can get that date down. But thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate all the input. I'm really pleased at the values activity and all the participation we had there. So thanks so much for joining us today. And we'll see you in September.
And Rosalind, it does look like we're just asking for some feedback that daytime workshops still continue to work for everyone.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, if a daytime workshop, the 1 to 3 o'clock time slot, and even the platform, the go-to platform, we're also curious for any feedback on if the time and the platform are still comfortable with all of you all, and it's a good way to share our information with you and get feedback from you.
Yes, I'd say they both the platform works for me, the daytime works for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Frank. Yeah. And I'm seeing same thoughts coming in from Ricky and Peter over the chat. As well as Mark Linshield. Thanks. All right. Well, thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to stop our recording.